Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, How to End a Slow Rolling Crisis, Lessons from the Northside of Cape Breton. But we will invite folks to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat box. I'm joined today by Ed Michalik, and hopefully I pronounced that right. I just got a little tutorial, Ed, just before the call. Hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly.
Perfectly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So just as Liz mentioned, we do want to take some time to do a gratitude and land acknowledgement. I myself am situated in Waterloo, so that is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. We do invite you to also write in the chat box which land that you are situated as well, just as we take this time for truth and reconciliation in our own communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. And I just want to acknowledge that yesterday was National Indigenous Peoples Day, and so want to acknowledge that as well. So thank you, Grace, for that. And so I think you're going to also tell us about the technology considerations.
Yeah, so if at any point throughout the webinar, if you do have any questions, feel free to message me directly in the chat box. You will receive a full recording of this webinar alongside with the slides as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to just ask me, and I'll also be putting in some resources. So just look out for that. Back to you, Liz. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Grace. Grace is our great technology support and leads us in our webinar work at Tamarack. So we're very appreciative of her support and her work. Hey, this webinar is brought to you by the Tamarack Institute. We have a ton of resources on our website, and we have provided you with a link to that. So when you get the email with the slide deck, you'll get the link to the Tamarack website for those of you that haven't been there, but actually many of you have been because you registered via that website. A recent resource that we just released and I thought was relevant to the conversation we're having today, Ed, is a 10 guide. And this guide is really about reconnecting and making community essential. This was done by our partners at Deepening Community within the Tamarack Institute. So a 10 guide, the way we develop 10 guides at Tamarack is there are 10 good ideas, 10 questions to consider, 10 community-based stories, and then 10 resources that you might want to follow up on. So please feel free to download that resource. The link again is on the slide. I want to begin by welcoming everybody. So my name's Liz Weaver and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. And I want to welcome you to the webinar, How to End a Slow Rolling Crisis, Lessons from Northside Cape Breton, and introduce you to my colleague, Ed Michalik. And Ed and I have had some very interesting conversations. I think now for at least 8 months, you and I have been talking about, the notion of crisis and slow rolling crises and how do we as communities navigate our way through them. And I think that that's really going to be the big part of the conversation today. This was part, Ed, of the research that you did and some of the talks with our partners, Inspiring Communities Nova Scotia, the Invictus Research and Talks. And I also included a link to that. So why don't I just spend a few minutes introducing you to everybody, and then we're going to find out who's in our virtual room. So Ed was born and raised in Cape Breton's coal mining hub, Glace Bay, growing up in an area where life was cheap. There were 1,321 men killed in the pits, including 2 of his uncles. He was by necessity attuned to chaos and deprivation. The experience pushed him to study the effects of trauma across generations. And so I think you bring a lot of personal experience to our conversation today. Ed has a doctorate in interdisciplinary studies from the University of New Brunswick. He was recently the research lead for the Project Invictus, a comprehensive community study of Cape Breton's Northside. He's now bootstrapping his research firm, Bonfire, and designing follow-up work to the Invictus work that you've done. So welcome, Ed. Anything before we have the folks introduce themselves in a bit of a poll question, anything that you would like to share with the folks on the call so that they can learn a little bit more about you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Liz, for having me. And it's been wonderful talking to you over the winter. And I want to thank Northside Rising and Inspiring Communities for sponsoring and supporting the work. And also, I really want to thank everyone who's shown up today on the interwebs. I really appreciate that. And I hope you're all well and feeling good. What would I say about myself that's not in that little bio? In every way, I'm a complete member researcher. I did not escape the blast radius of coal mining culture in Cape Breton. I left Glace Bay with my mother in 1985 to go to the psychiatric ward at the Victoria General Hospital. I was there for 5 months, and I was in and out of hospital for 2 years. After that, I was in and out of various halfway houses for 4 years, and I lived for a decade on welfare, family benefits. It was only when I got a chance as a disabled person to go to school. There was a sort of a free program that I being a hopeful fellow, despite it all, my dysthymia, I said, I'm going for this because there are riches in the world that I want to avail myself of. So I wanted to do that. So, you know, I bleed Cape Breton. That causes me bias, obviously, but also gives me special insight. What else can I say? I'm currently researching and helping in the design of a museum in Whitney Pier for the Polish community, of whom I'm a member and a proud member. There will be a written Invictus report. I'm thinking it will come out probably in September. Also, to have free and unfettered access to the airwaves, I'm going to create a YouTube channel called Bonfire TV. I'm working on that now, so that I can disseminate research and do knowledge translation, which is my job.
Yeah.
And I think I'd leave it there. Time is short, and I think we should get on with business.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ed. That I think provides some really important context to the conversation today. And I also think, you know, we all bring our experiences of life, right? And they inform who we are and what we do. So thank you for sharing that.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
So wanted to let everybody know. So we've learned a little bit about Ed. We want to learn a little bit more about all of you. So we had 155 folks register for the workshop. We typically at Tamarack have less people that show up, but we certainly know that when we send out the recording, we have an avid listening audience. I think with the advent of podcasts, people listen more in a time that's convenient to them. But you can see really the scope. So we've got folks joining us from right across Canada, as we heard earlier, from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Australia, and from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we also have folks that represent different kind of sectors and perspectives that have registered. So they include philanthropy, government, health, social services, family supports, a whole variety of different perspectives, and education as well. I pulled out of the list, and you might be profiled here, but I pulled out of the list a few organizations that I did a little further research on that you might want to follow up. They do some really interesting community-based work. And so How We Thrive, the Social Enterprise Fund, Shift and Build, these are just some examples. And of course, as you mentioned, Ed, Northside Rising and Inspiring Communities. So feel free after the call to check out some of these organizations. Now we want to just really quickly do a poll with everyone. And so I'm going to ask Grace. Thank you, Grace. Look at that magically. And I'll invite everybody who's on the call today to answer this poll. And it's really about the focus of your work. Is your work focused on, and probably you can answer multiple of these, but we really invite you to answer, what the primary focus of your work is. But is it on ending poverty? Is it on building stronger neighborhoods, supporting young people, navigating climate, focusing on immigrants and newcomers, supporting children, addressing health and mental health, or housing and homelessness, or another priority? And can see that you're all, well, many of you have already answered the poll. We'll maybe give you another 30 seconds for the rest of you to answer. We're at about just about there in terms of responses. Or about 78%, Ed. I don't know if you can see the poll as it's dancing forward. I can certainly see it on my screen.
Okay.
Okay. We're just when we get to 85%, I'm going to close the poll and show you all the results. Okay. Some of you might be reading the list and having to scroll through the poll. Well, let's end the poll now. This kind of gives us a good overview of who's with us. So we've got about 32% of our participants are focused, their primary focus is building stronger neighborhoods. We've got 29% that are focused on addressing health and mental health issues. And then the rest of them are really spread across, with only a small, only just 12%. Or sorry, 2% that are working on immigrants and newcomers. So the other ones appear kind of equally in the poll, but the focus is stronger neighborhoods and on dealing with health and mental health and issues in communities. So that gives you a sense, Ed, of who is in our virtual room and who's joined us today. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the poll. We've heard a little bit more about you, so I jumped that question a wee bit early, but I want to start now our conversation. And Ed and I are going to talk for, about 20 to 25 minutes. During this, if Ed says something that, sparks a question for you, we would invite you to add your questions either into the chat box or into the Q&A panel. So we invite you to do either of those things. If they're in the Q&A panel, we can pick them out more clearly. And towards the end of the call, we're going to bring some of those questions forward. So hopefully you will hear something that tweaks a question for you. Okay, Ed. So we're going to talk about slow rolling crises. And this is what I think you and I have been chatting about, the last number of months over the winter and the last number of months. And we've been seeing, all experiencing collectively this kind of slow rolling crisis of COVID, right? Where it seemed to start off as an emergency, but then, over the, what is it now, 280 plus days, or no, it's more than that. It would be 780 plus days that has kind of become something that we've all adapted to. So what are some of the unique features of a longer term or a slow rolling crisis, which are different than something that is immediate, like a forest fire?
Well, I think to begin to understand what a slow rolling crisis is, you have to unpack the phrase. You have to take the noun and separate the adjective phrase. So let's start with crisis. So what is a crisis? Well, a crisis is a definitive moment, a turning point, an inflection point, a moment when something is decided. In medicine, a crisis would be something like a stroke or a heart attack or an aneurysm. And when that happens, the result is someone dies or recovers and gets better. In diplomacy, a crisis would be war. In labor, the world of labor would be a strike. So crises tend to be definitive and relatively brief affairs, relatively. So for example, a war would end with a treaty, a strike would end with a contract, and hopefully somebody who had a heart attack will get a pacemaker and go on. Now, when you look at a slow rolling crisis, it's something that endures, right? It's a bit like what COVID might be becoming now. It's gone from being a pandemic, hopefully, to an endemic, right? So basically you have the original crisis, the crisis moment, and then that's followed by surges. So, COVID arrived, and it arrived, we had this novel virus. It spread asymptomatically, and we were all caught off guard. But within a year, we had vaccines, and within another year, we had Omicron, which conferred sort of widespread natural immunity. So we may be heading from a pandemic situation to an endemic situation with COVID. Now, an endemic can be very bad. Malaria kills an awful lot of children in Africa and the Mediterranean and elsewhere. So what happens is that basically in a slow rolling social crisis, like what you would get in Cape Breton, you have a conflagration followed by these sort of flare-ups and surges. That's how I would define a slow rolling crisis. In Cape Breton, the slow rolling crisis consisted of a crisis moment. There truly was a crisis, which I call the Long War, that went from 1910 to 1925. And then there were these surges. There was one in 1967, which is where we get the advent of statism. I'll talk about that in a second. And then at the end of the 90s, you get the collapse of industrial Cape Breton, industrial culture. So I'll just say a few things about the Long War, which I have knowledge of as a historian and certainly as someone who's putting this museum together. And it basically as someone whose uncle's grandfather and great-grandfathers worked in the pit. So I know of this firsthand. From 1909 to 1925, Cape Breton was convulsed with the most vicious labor strikes in Canada and perhaps in most of North America. There was a crisis in strike in 1909, 1921, 22, 23, and 25. It was constant. People were thrown out of their homes. Mothers would use burlap bags to create clothing for their children. So they went through the labor wars. Then they went through the Great War. Then they went through the dress rehearsal for COVID, which was the Spanish influenza in 1919. And then you have widespread hunger and malnutrition and cholera even in Cape Breton. So by the time you get through the first third of the 20th century in industrial Cape Breton, you have a culture that is shell-shocked. Basically, hunger, or I should say poverty, addiction, and violence are baked into the culture. Alcohol was self-medication. I would go through the temperance records from the province, and they would basically throw up their hands in Cape Breton. But Cape Bretoners went through so much. So, I talk about 1,321 men killed in the pits. Most of those men and boys were killed in the first third of the 20th century. So, and then for every one who was killed, there would be 5 people who lost a hand or a limb or something. And so then you have their families, their wives, their children. And so basically you have a traumatized community that learns how to, in the lack of, lacking grief counseling and therapy, often turns to alcohol and violence. Okay, so that's the crisis. And basically the culture that you have today, that includes me, starts there. In 1967, coal and steel almost collapsed. So at that point, you get the state in the form of the federal and provincial governments doing a massive intervention into the Cape Breton economy. From 1967 to 2000, I think, was it almost $5 billion was put into the economy to transform it from an industrial to a post-industrial economy. That would be almost $7 billion 2022 dollars. A whole economic development apparatus and system was put in place. Almost for an island that never cracked 150,000 people, they were spending over $200 million a year. What's ironic is that the unemployment rate today in Cape Breton is about the same as it was in 1967, roughly a third higher than the mainland. So for all the efforts, it really didn't make much of a net gain. The real collapse and the real tragedy, I see Dave Soller maybe here, and he knows it well, my friend Dave Soller from Glace Bay, was at the end and it's just a terrible surge in this crisis. You have amalgamation. So you have the coal towns and the steel city coming together. But what happens is that the towns and the city lose their local governance, and people lose their connection to how their world works. Then at the same time, in the summer of 1995, you get the introduction of a casino and opioids at the same time, OxyContin. The opioid crisis hit Cape Breton in the mid-90s. It hit before it did in many parts of North America, and it's persisted. And then at the end of the 20th century, you have the end of coal and steel. So for example, the last real coal mine to close was on the north side in Point Coney Prince Mine in 2000. So from then on, governments haven't spent the way they have, but they kind of spend. You have this sort of institutional sprawl of economic development and government money, and you have a century's worth of addiction and pain that has never really been dealt with, because frankly, the crisis of the first third of the century was so overwhelming, and it never has really gotten addressed. So that's the answer to the island's slow rolling crisis. If you look at the graphic on, I guess what's my left, I have no idea what left it is to you, but that is a map from the Nova Scotia Department of Health and Wellness about material and psychosocial deprivation in the province. Where you want to be on that map is somewhere where it's lime green. If you'll notice, there's about 100-kilometer prosperity belt around the city of Halifax, and it goes to the north to Truro, to Wolfville in the west, and the Mahone Bay in the south. Beyond that, things get poorer and more distraught. So if you'll notice on the far eastern tip of Cape Breton, that things are dark purple. And so the worst material and psychosocial deprivation in the province is there. I wanted to place this infographic here because if you had made an infographic for this in 1925, it would have been exactly the same. So there's always been a green belt around Halifax, and there's always been a purple belt in Cape Breton.
Yeah.
And you and I talked about the slow rolling crisis kind of become like the wallpaper in a funeral parlor or in a beauty salon. You just forget it's there. So basically what you're looking at is a map that is not different from what it would have been a century ago. So nothing has changed. In Buddhism, I'm a very poor Buddhist practitioner, but it's samsara's cyclical suffering. La plus ça change, nothing has really changed.
So it is interesting, right? I think, as I'm listening to you, one of the points that I pick up is this kind of trauma that the community has faced, and multiple layers of trauma, right? And I think we're learning more and more about, approaching things from a trauma-informed practice, right? And so that might be something that we explore in the course of the conversation. But the reality is that there is trauma, right? And that trauma-informed approach is really necessary in communities that have longer standing trauma or multiple layers of trauma, or how trauma is showing up, as it would be in our families, as it would be in our communities.
Correct. I was born in 1964, but in a way I was born on March 31st, 1954, when my uncle was killed in the pit. After that, my grandfather started to drink and gamble and womanize. And so his children were all adult children, and they married adult children. And I was an adult child who ended up having to deal with my things. It's interesting. I started off by trying to heal myself in a psychotherapist's office. And then as I started to study, I realized, well, actually, my great tragedy is rather mundane and run of the mill in my part of the world. Everybody suffered this. And if I could just throw out a couple of numbers from my doctoral dissertation, which I highly recommend people read, Cape Breton Gothic. If you are an adult child, you have a 50% chance of marrying someone who's an adult child, and a 25% chance of becoming someone with substance use problems yourself. So in Cape Breton, you have a largely self-contained population that really hasn't changed much in 100 years. So you have a static population, waves of trauma and poverty. And so you just have this thing rolling along, so much so that it becomes ordinary.
Mhm.
And, you know, my therapist is Simon Sherry, is a wonderful research psychologist at Dal. And he says to me, he said, Ed, a disproportionate number of my clients are from Cape Breton. And he said, and I said, oh, really? And he said, what passes for normal behavior in Cape Breton is just mind-boggling. So this much addiction, this much poverty becomes just part of the landscape, and so it just thrums and hums along.
Yeah.
And so it gets kind of lost, but it's real.
And I do think, you know, what you're illustrating and what you've illustrated in the example are how there's complex issues that are often interconnected, right? So there's poverty, there's homelessness, there's mental health and addictions. And when they become interwoven and interconnected, and I would even argue that there's economic disparity, right, that is connected to poverty, they become more difficult to shift. And so as you think about, you know, Cape Breton, and you've given us the historical context, but what's some of the current things that you uncovered in your research that, you know, are important to lift up, so that if we're trying to figure out strategies to deeply shift this kind of slow rolling crisis, we need to know what the data tells us. So
Right.
Why don't you walk us through these, Ed?
Okay, right. So in the summer and fall of 2020, a small group of researchers led by me and my colleagues Samantha Lowe's and Lilla Roy, we took a survey that I created with the late, great Dr. Margaret Dykeman, and we ran it through the Northside. We got a response rate of 502, which is a robust sample for a population of roughly 17,000. We clicked all our demos. We did 41 semi-structured interviews, 2 focus groups and talks. So this thing has been vetted to death. And Margaret and I gave it our best. So one of the things we looked at in our survey was how hopeful are Northsiders. And we used the University of Kansas model of state hope, and we asked Northsiders about their sense of agency and pathways in goal acquisition. That's basically how hope functions as a psychological construct. So we use the metric is a 48-point metric. Someone who has high hope or thriving hope would score a 40 in our survey. Someone who had stable or moderate hope would score about 36. And someone with a score of 30 would have baseline hopefulness. Beneath 30 is despair and depression and mental illness. We corroborated these things with our interviews as well. So what you'll notice here is what I see, and it was clear in our work, is the class divide in Cape Breton. If you'll notice, the people who always have enough to get by, or usually have enough to get by, their hope is decent. It's stable. Once you get down to the folks who only sometimes have enough to get by, or those who never have enough to get by, the indigent poor, those are dangerously bad numbers. These are people who are lacking a sense of agency and pathway, right? So I would say, I mean, it's interesting, that score of 25.8 for people who never have enough. If you couldn't clock a 30 in our research, you needed immediate psychiatric care. That's my learned opinion, having interviewed a lot of these people as well. So you have a lot of people who are poor, who are straddling hopelessness. And frankly, those people who are really poor are in great need of help immediately. That would be what I found. And if we could move to the next slide, we'll see a trend developing here. Okay. One of the things that concerns me most is what I call the emerging lost generations. I'm not sure if we have the hope by age, but let's look at these numbers. When we asked people how they were, we saw that 29% of under 40s were extremely lonely. We also saw that under 40s have a 33% poverty rate. There are a lot of studies about poverty, not a lot, there are studies about poverty in Cape Breton and youth poverty, childhood poverty, being in the 30s. Well, I think what breaks news here is that even young adulthood poverty is in the mid 30s. These are almost First Nations levels of poverty on the north side. So these people are lonely, they're lacking in hope, and they're poor. So if this is how you're going to handle this, this is your leadership generation, this is where they should be hopefully getting married or planning a life, buying a house, whatever. They're basically just scraping by. Those poverty numbers are truly striking. And I think, frankly, this is probably the first crew to see these numbers is here today.
Well, and it's a little bit of a call to action, right? Because these are young people. I think when we look at the broader perspective of young people, I had a conversation yesterday with some folks in Europe, some folks who are involved in philanthropy and community in Europe. And the thing that they lifted up for me was, that this generation of folks, not only in Cape Breton, but I think in a lot of places have faced multiple traumas, right? So there might be economic traumas, or they're carrying a big debt of education, that there's COVID, that there's the climate crisis. So they are carrying those with them. I think in Cape Breton, what you're showing is that it's true and deeper, but that this generation, that all of us need to be thinking differently about how we create work environments for them, how the community, how we support them in getting agency, how the community has to be, different because of the data. Right.
And, I couldn't agree more with what you said. This is a sort of a North American, European phenomenon, but it's sort of doubly deep in a place like the Northside or industrial Cape Breton. So you have people who should be going into their prime just struggling to make it. Now these numbers, let's go back to.
I'm going too quickly forward here.
Okay. This we asked people questions about whether they have problems with drugs or alcohol. And this is really important. So these are self-reported numbers. So it's interesting, you can talk about bias, but all we're doing here is reporting what people told us, right? So we went at, we need to go back one, I think, do we?
Oh, okay.
Right. We need to go back.
Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. I apologize. Hang on.
No problem.
I'm going to just go, so we were here.
One ahead of it, yeah.
I do apologize for this slight technical problem. So we're just going to go to the next slide. Here we go.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is a key slide. So in 2017, there was a report that said 1 in 7 Nova Scotians, 14%, at some point during their life have problems with substances. That was from a Milestones on Our Journey report. So we asked Northsiders if they had problems with substances. And so this is what they reported. So you personally, 29%, your spouse, 37%. What I want our viewers to know is that this survey, like many others, skews female. So what you have here is women mostly talking about their partners, male partners. When they talk about their coworkers, they have 47% have problems with drugs or alcohol. Their family, 55%. Your neighbors, 61%. The score of 29%, although this is a rough apples to oranges comparison is more than double the provincial average. Those are high numbers, and I think they're low. People in these surveys tend to underreport. The reason I think it's higher is because if you'll notice, people say that 61% of their neighbors have problems. So my guess is that they may be projecting some of their problems onto their neighbors. The reason I say this too is we ran this through 2 focus groups, one of which was with a group of people who are drug users. And they all said to a person that these numbers are too conservative. So we can speculate about this, but the bottom line is that Northsiders self-reported having drug and alcohol problems at least twice the provincial average. And some of these numbers are just mind-bogglingly high. Now we can move to the next second slide. So again, let's do this by class. And there's a myth in Cape Breton about being this sort of uniform, unified rock in the sea standing together. One of the things our research showed is that there are very strong class cleavages on the island. There are 2 Cape Bretons. In fact, part of my report will be a chapter called The 2 Cape Bretons. So what you'll notice here about self-reporting with drug and alcohol problems is that those who always have enough to get by are more or less in the ballpark with the provincial average. Those who are blue collar usually have enough, or they start to spire. And then once you get in again to the poor and the indigent poor, then those numbers go through the roof. Those are dangerously high numbers. If you look at the last number above it, there's a black circle that says 21%. The 21%, those are severe. They reported severe substance use problems. So those are dangerous class-ridden numbers. Here we go by youth, or by age, I should say. One of the things you'll see in all the data, because basically what you're getting today is not even the tip of the tip of the top of the tip of the tip of the data that we have. It would take years to unpack what we have. So you'll notice that life seems to get better once you head into your 50s in Cape Breton. But if you're in those early cohorts, 46, 40, 33, those people are self-reporting problem substance use at those rates. If you look at sort of the millennials, 15% of them report severe drug and alcohol problems. Next slide. So at a certain point, and I don't know if she's listening, but I want to give a shout out to Lila Roy. She teaches in the nursing program at CBU, and she was our numbers guru, our Nate Silver. And I said, Lila, this looks really bad. I said, are there any people who don't have any contacts with drug or alcohol problems? And so Lila went to her boiler room and started clawing through the numbers. So we were looking for primary or secondary contact with addiction or drug and alcohol problems. So the question we asked were, do you have problems with drug or alcohol? Secondary contact would be, does your spouse or your partner have contacts with drug or alcohol or problems? And the third was, does somebody in your family have problems with drugs or alcohol? So these are close contacts. Do I have a problem? Does my spouse have a problem? Does my uncle or aunt or whatnot have a problem? And so, Lila came back and she said 85% of the population of the North Side has at least one point of contact with harmful substance use. That's almost everybody. So at times when my language is curt or my temper flares or I lose my sense of proper scholarly etiquette, it's because I look at a place that's burning and people are suffering. I know Dave Soller here, who's one of my heroes and one of the greats, he would see the same thing in Glace Bay. He knows the fires are burning. And so that I mean, personally, that number alone would justify the survey we did, the expenditure.
And
so
this,
last week,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say this is another version of that slide. The call to, it's almost like a call to action slide, right?
It's a call, yes. Absolutely, Liz. What you're looking at here is a 5-alarm fire.
Yeah.
My
And
friend Dave has been putting out 5-alarm fires for at least a decade. Christine Porter in Sydney has been putting out 5-alarm fires for a decade.
So I want to kind of now turn us a little bit to how do we get a community to maybe be, act, and think differently when it's, this crisis that has slowly rolled, but maybe it's getting to that point where it is a 3-alarm, 4-alarm, 5-alarm fire. How do we need to become different in terms of our response, Ed? What are some of the things that you've uncovered in your research?
Well, let me see. It's interesting because we're gonna do this slide and we're gonna stop because it's very bleak and it only gets bleaker, right? So the question is, how would you, the question was, how would you refocus a community? I think, was that the question?
Yeah.
Well, ideally, you would sort of come together in groups and cohorts and pick some low-hanging fruit, right? You'd build some social capital. You say, let's come together to work on this. You would do that. That would be a model. But to do any kind of community initiative, it requires an intangible resource called social capital, right? And the basis of social capital is trust. And what Margaret and I, the late Dr. Dykeman and I, were interested in were the study of trust. We both studied it. I studied it in a Mediterranean context. Okay, stop there. And she studied, go back one. And she studied it in the prison system in Cape Breton. If you could go back one. Thank you. So we asked, these are Margaret, she would ask these questions at the correctional center. And so these are Margaret's classics. And so we said, let's ask them to the entire Northside community. So we asked, how often are you afraid of some people? How often are people judging you? How often do you have to keep your guard up? Now, these answers are done by class, right? So what you'll notice is that regardless of class, over 50% of the population are afraid of people, think that people are judging them, and that they have to keep their guard up. And of course, the poorer you are, the higher those numbers are. But those numbers are disconcerting in any respect. So the idea is, how do you come together to do big things or even small things when people are basically afraid of each other? Well, let's look at one more slide on trust and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'm gonna just jump to that slide if we have it.
Right. Let's see.
Oh, wrong way. Oh my goodness gracious. Sorry about this, people.
There you go. All right.
No, I'm gonna go to the
okay, let's stop here. This is important because we were talking about youth, right? And that generation that's burdened. So here Margaret and I created a trust metric. We said we took some trust scales that weren't that good, and because we were both really interested in it, we said, let's make our own. And we had it validated by Lilleroy, so it's statistically golden, and we reran it. And so we asked people basic questions about trusting other people. And so a low measure of trust, generalized trust here, would be your silver score, and your dark blue score would be high to moderate trust. So if you look at those trust numbers, they're dismal to mediocre, right? Look at youth. 89% of them scored low trust. And then that, when you go up a cohort, it drops to 72 and then it's 53. You basically don't get a 50-50 split on being trustworthy or trusting until you get to the Gen Xers. Older people tend to be very trusting, but in general, people don't trust their neighbors. What I find really paradoxical, and if we had 5 more of these Zoom things to do it, some of the good stuff we saw in the Northside, it's not all bleak, is one, Northsiders love the Northside. Overwhelmingly. If I had stats on that, I would show you those. I do somewhere else. They also have warm, close family relationships. The problem is when you get beyond your driveway, right? That's when it gets tricky.
Well,
so
and
I think you go ahead.
I think the illustration here supplements the illustration that you had a couple of slides ago about young people, right? And what do we need? Where does the focus need to be? This kind of shows you that. And of course, we know that, young people sometimes are less trusting of others anyways, but this shows an even more crisis kind of point for young people. And how do we work and act differently? I'm going to move us to the next slide.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, which is the 5 reasons for low trust, which I think is helpful to talk about, Ed.
Right. So the number one cause for low trust is trauma. If you come from an addicted family, whether it's alcohol or drugs, there are libraries full of literature on how it destroys a sense of trust. I don't have the time to be articulate about it today, but I think we can assume that that's the case. Then there's this scarcity thinking. There's a zero-sum socioeconomic calculus in Cape Breton. You could say it goes back to the Gaels who were raiding herdsmen from Scotland, but also you have a century's worth of poverty. And then you have sort of the state dropping crumbs, grants and projects. So you have people and organizations competing for crumbs, right? So there's clientelism, there's patronage. People are not trustworthy, or not trusting, I should say, of their neighbors because of this poverty. Then there's literally the question of insularity. Margaret and I were curious about how far Cape Bretoners traveled. So we asked people from the North Side, how far do you travel? Now, I know it was COVID, so people didn't travel that far, but we saw that Northsiders were hard pressed to make the trip across to Sydney, across the harbor. And they were almost never went to the mainland. So these are folks who basically live within 7 to 10 live their lives within 7 to 10 kilometers of their home. So your view of the world is circumscribed by your surroundings. And if you don't move, then your sense of the world becomes very small. Tribalism, I have a whole chapter on that in my dissertation. I'll leave that there. The other thing is small town surveillance. Small town Cape Breton is sort of a Goldilocks zone for simmering paranoia, because the towns are small enough that everybody can know a little something about your business, but they're big enough that you can be somewhat anonymous. So you have all of these other factors, and then you throw this into the mix. I will share this quote from a taxi driver from Glace Bay, who said, "You can't fart in Glace Bay without somebody in Sydney knowing about it 25 minutes later." Right?
Well, that's a provocative statement, but
there you go. That's about as provocative as I'm going to make it today, Liz.
Hey, so I know we're running out of time, and I want to get to some of the questions, but I also want to jump ahead. Everybody's going to get the whole deck, but I want to jump ahead to just this possibility slide, this kind of future, what might be possible. You identify some, obstacles to meaningful change, and some of them are, fatigue and political will and resources. So I think that those are important. But one of the things that you do is also talk about how do we reframe the narrative. So before we open it up for questions, I want you to kind of spend a couple of minutes, maybe just addressing this slide.
Right, and I think this is where we should close here, and then we can have questions if you don't mind. I think this is a good spot.
Yeah.
So, I thought a lot about it. It's like, okay, you have these almost seemingly intractable problems that go back a century and seem to be boiling over. So, if I were addressing the people of the North Side or my beloved Glace Bay, this is what I would say. I would say that cultures aren't speedboats, they're battleships. You cannot change a culture on a dime. This is not Miami Vice. We can't spin our little boat around in the harbor. This is going to take a long time. You're looking at a generation's work. If this has been going on for over 100 years, there's no reason to think you can solve this in 5 or 10 years, or even 15 years. So slow down. This is going to be a marathon. The second thing I would say is that there are no silver bullets. When people are in pain, they often they want a panacea, or they want someone or something to come and save them. When I was on the north side, I'd often hear talk about proto-case as a business. Oh, there's proto-case. We have industry. It's going to come. It's going to save us. Well, that's great, but you need at least 15 proto-cases to get back into the game. or in the past, it would be, well, they'll just open a coal mine, or we'll do something, or someone will give us something. Well, I said in North Sydney, and this was provocative. I said, even if Jeff Bezos cut Cape Breton a check for $2 billion, I'm not sure it would immediately solve the problems, because the problems are deeper than mere economics. There's sort of problems of the soul, problems of human resources that have been damaged, and damaged psyches and damaged trust. Just dropping money on it, you need that. Don't get me wrong, you need a lot of it, a lot of money, but it's not enough. So there are no silver bullets, and there are no smoking guns. So, Halifax is not your enemy. Ottawa is not your enemy. Buddy who down the street who had some drag and got the job you wanted is not your enemy. This sense of otherization, this sense of tribalism, that really is not helpful. It might be good to let that one go. And then finally, I would say, don't think in terms of a final victory. My great hero is Barack Obama, and he always talked about perfecting the union, right? Not that you could ever make it perfect, but you could always make it better. And sometimes, I hear people and they're in despair, and they said, if we just get there, it will be okay. The journey will stop. It will end. We can relax. Now, I understand that comes from fatigue and burnout, right? But it's like, no, there are no final victories. We have to pull together and work together and keep continually perfecting the union, because that's what makes a strong community. And I think on that note, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I think, Ed, you're absolutely right that even as we begin to change, do work and intervene in a community shifts, right? So we've got to be in real time, kind of observing what is shifting in the community. And I think you're right. I think it is that the victory is both in the doing and in the shifting that you're seeing happen. Hey, there's one more slide I wanted you to maybe speak to really quickly. Again, I go in the wrong direction, but I really loved this final slide, not that one, but this one. So, because I do think that, and you referred to it a little bit earlier, but I think it's also really important to bring it forward.
Right. So, I'm 57 years old. And what I've learned at the age of 57 is that everything is futile, especially despair. The most futile thing is despair. And as a Catholic, a lapsed Catholic, I would always say, sursum corda, lift up your heart. There's a basic warmth and intelligence in the human spirit that's always there, regardless of our condition. And I saw that on the North Side, and it's in the numbers. The Northsiders love their community, period. The satisfaction rates in some respects would often be hovering near 90%, right? They also value their family lives tremendously. Now, I could say that there's a lot of irony in this, in the sense that they don't trust their neighbors, and these families are riven by addiction, poverty, and abuse. But that baseline affection, warmth, intelligence, fellow feeling, humor, even gallows humor is always there. So I would say, so long as you have that and it's there, you can do something good with that. It's the start there. Like, look at those two old friends on the beach, right? Their stress hormones don't look like they're overflowing. They're chilling on the beach. If you can chill on the beach, you might be able to do something for your community.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Hey, we're running out of time, and what we will commit to is bringing your questions forward to Ed. And when we send out the post recording, we will have your questions answered. We unfortunately don't have time for questions today, but I have found this to be a really, really interesting conversation, Ed. And I felt like this was an important slide to show as well. Here we go in the wrong direction again. As we leave, want to thank everybody for joining us today in the call. Just let you know that Tamarack has a few things coming up in our work going forward. So we have 2 workshops that are coming up in the future, and we have a whole lot of webinars similar to this, but with different topics and different speakers. And so if you visit our webpage, we invite you to either, sign up for workshops or sign up for webinars. There's also a learn at your own pace kind of series of workshops as well for those of you that are interested in learning more about these really important issues that we're talking about. But before I close off completely, I wanted to say, Ed, that I think that today for me has been a really important webinar to consider the historical context of community, the current context of community, but also the things that can create that that place for change, right? And also the call to action, which is the crisis, right? So you kind of took us on this journey over the course of the last hour, which really was, I think, a very illustrative journey. And I think it's a journey of the Northside, but it's also a journey in other communities. They might not be as deep or as or resemble in the same way. It might be poverty, it might be homelessness, there might be another issue that is intractable. But we certainly know that in Canada, there are lots of communities really struggling with opioid crises and addictions and mental health issues. And that certainly has been something. And so I think what you've provided, at least for me, what you've provided is this journey of, at what point do we say, hey, enough is enough, we've got to act. The fire is burning.
Right. Oh, it's interesting. I just want to say one final thing is I started my doctorate in the history department in the early 2000s. And then I saw the fire burning. And I said, well, okay, I've done enough history. I better study sociology because I need to understand what's happening now. So I think one informs the other. I think context is king or queen. So the more context we can get, the better. And so my call to action was watching my community burn. And I said, well, the past is present. The past is not over. It's not even past. So let's do something about it, shall we?
Yeah. And let's use the data to tell us where we can act first, which is, I think, the other part of the story. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to your questions and to further engagement with you. So thanks, everybody.
Have a good weekend. How we doing?
Good. People are still just signing off. We'll pull forward the questions. There was some conversation in the chat box, so we'll pull forward those kinds of things. We've got folks that are still just signing off from the call. Great. Hey, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. You work a slide deck like nobody's business.
Well, I don't know. I wasn't quite on top of my game today, but I didn't realize that you had them kind of flipping a little bit. When I looked at it, I didn't look at it for the flipping. So yeah, it's all good.
Well, yeah. So I think it was a good time, and I think we may have helped the cause.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I'll follow up with you directly. Okay.
All right. All the best.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.